Hey guys, tonight we're stepping behind the stone walls and iron gates of medieval convents into a world where silence was golden, prayer was constant, and desire found a way to whisper through the cracks. The secret sex lives of medieval nuns. And before we dive in, just a heads up, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's scandalous though, it definitely is, but because if you'd lived as a medieval nun with even the faintest flutter of human longing, chances are you'd have ended up in solitary confinement, excommunicated or worse, depending on just how creative your sins were. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin tonight's pilgrimage not in a bustling medieval marketplace or a knight's castle, but in the hushed corridors of a Benedictine convent somewhere in 12th century France. The air smells like beeswax candles, damp stone, and something faintly herbal, maybe lavender from the monastery gardens. It's quiet here. The kind of quiet that makes every footstep echo like a confession. The walls are thick, built to keep the world out and the sacred in. But as you'll discover, those same walls that were meant to protect these women from temptation also became the stage for some of the most forbidden desires in medieval history. Now let's get one thing straight from the start. When we think of medieval nuns today, we picture women in flowing habits, heads bowed in prayer, living lives of perfect chastity and devotion. That's the story the church wanted us to remember. But the reality was far messier, far more human, and infinitely more fascinating than any religious text would have you believe. See, here's what nobody tells you about medieval convents. They weren't just houses of worship. They were some of the only places in medieval Europe where women could gain education, wield political power, and yes, live without direct male supervision. For many women, the convent wasn't a prison. It was freedom. And with that freedom came something the church desperately tried to suppress. The undeniable fact that nuns were still women, with all the desires, longings, and human needs that entailed. Tonight, we're going to uncover the hidden world that existed behind convent doors. The passionate love letters exchanged between sisters. The secret relationships that bloomed in herb gardens and prayer cells. The elaborate schemes to smuggle lovers into sacred spaces. And yes, the shocking punishments that awaited those who were caught. But more than that, we're going to explore how these women, trapped between their spiritual calling and their human nature, navigated a world that demanded impossible perfection while offering very human temptations. I've spent months diving deep into church records, confession transcripts, and personal letters that somehow survived centuries of attempted erasure. What I found wasn't just a collection of scandals. It was a window into the souls of women who dared to love in a world that told them love was sin. And trust me, by the end of this series, you'll never look at a medieval convent the same way again. But before we open those convent doors and peer into the shadows where passion met piety, we need to understand just how these women ended up here in the first place. Because contrary to popular belief, most medieval nuns didn't choose the religious life out of burning spiritual devotion. They were sent there by families who couldn't afford dowries, by fathers who had too many daughters, by political arrangements that needed inconvenient women tucked safely away. Some arrived as children, barely old enough to understand what they were giving up. Others came as adults, fleeing marriages, scandals, or simply seeking the only form of independence available to medieval women. Imagine being 13 years old, torn from everything you've ever known, and told that you'll spend the rest of your life in service to God. That you'll never marry, never have children, never know the touch of a lover. That your body, your desires, your very humanity must be sacrificed for the sake of your eternal soul. Now imagine trying to suppress those feelings for 50, 60, even 70 years. It's no wonder that beneath the surface of these supposedly sacred institutions, human nature found a way to assert itself. The church, of course, had rules for everything: when to pray, how to dress, what to eat, and most importantly, how to conduct yourself with your fellow sisters. Physical contact was strictly regulated, private conversations were forbidden, even glances that lingered too long could be cause for penance. But rules, as we'll discover, were made to be broken, or at least very creatively interpreted. One of the most fascinating things I uncovered in my research was how these women developed an entire secret language of desire. Flowers left in prayer books carried coded messages. The way a sister arranged her veil could signal interest. Even the timing of their appearances in the chapel became a form of communication. They created a hidden world within the sacred world, where love could flourish in the shadows of religious devotion. And it wasn't just romantic love we're talking about here. These convents became hotbeds of intellectual passion, artistic expression, and yes, physical desire. Some of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts of the medieval period came from convents. Some of the most influential political letters were written by abbesses. And some of the most passionate love poetry, well, that was hidden away in the margins of prayer books and the secret compartments of wooden chests. But perhaps what's most remarkable about these women is how they managed to create genuine relationships and communities within a system designed to isolate them. They formed what we might call chosen families, bonds that transcended the biological families that had cast them aside. They protected each other, covered for each other's transgressions, and yes, loved each other in ways that would have horrified their male superiors. The historical record, what little survives, is filled with tantalizing glimpses of these hidden lives. Court documents from ecclesiastical trials. Confession records where nuns admitted to sins that would make your medieval priest faint. Personal letters that somehow escaped the fires that consumed so much of women's writing from this period. Each document is like a piece of a vast puzzle, revealing the outlines of lives lived in the spaces between sacred and profane. Take, for example, the case of Sister Marguerite de Porret, a French nun whose mystical writings about divine love were so passionate, so erotically charged, that the Church declared them heretical. She was burned at the stake in 1310, not just for her ideas, but for the way she expressed them. Her crime wasn't just thinking forbidden thoughts, it was feeling them, writing them, sharing them with others who might be inspired to feel the same dangerous desires. Or consider the convent of Sant'Ambrogio in Rome, which in the 19th century was discovered to have been operating as what can only be described as a lesbian community for decades. When church investigators finally penetrated the convent's secrets, they found love letters, erotic art, and evidence of relationships that had lasted for years. The scandal was so enormous that the Vatican tried to bury it entirely, and it only came to light in recent decades when historians gained access to previously sealed archives. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that stretched across centuries and continents. From the great abbeys of England to the mountain convents of Italy, from the scholarly houses of Germany to the mystical communities of Spain, women found ways to love, to desire, to live as fully human beings despite the constraints placed upon them. But here's what makes these stories truly remarkable. These women weren't just rebelling against religious authority, they were creating new forms of spirituality, new ways of understanding the relationship between the sacred and the human. Many of them genuinely believed that their love for each other was a reflection of divine love, that their physical desires were manifestations of their spiritual longing for God. They developed theological justifications for their relationships that were sophisticated, nuanced, and deeply personal. This wasn't just about sex, though sex was certainly part of it. This was about women claiming agency over their own bodies, their own tahi hearts, their own spiritual lives, in a world that told them they had no right to any of those things. It was about creating spaces of intimacy and vulnerability in institutions designed to eliminate both. It was about finding ways to be fully human in a system that demanded they transcend their humanity. The Church's response when these relationships were discovered was swift and brutal. Public humiliation, solitary confinement, exile, and, in extreme cases, execution. The records are filled with cases of nuns who were made examples of, their punishments designed not just to correct their behaviour, but to terrorise other women who might be tempted to follow similar paths. Yet despite these consequences, the relationships continued. Love, it seems, was stronger than fear. What's perhaps most tragic about these stories is how thoroughly they were erased from official histories. The Church worked systematically to destroy evidence of these relationships, to rewrite the records, to create a sanitized version of convent life that matched their ideological needs. For centuries, these women's stories were lost, their voices silenced, their loves denied. It's only in recent decades, as historians have gained access to previously forbidden archives and developed new methods for reading between the lines of official documents, that we've begun to recover these hidden histories. And what we're discovering is that the secret lives of medieval nuns weren't just about individual relationships or personal desires. They reveal something fundamental about human nature, about the impossibility of completely suppressing love and longing, about the ways that women throughout history have found to claim agency and create meaning in their lives despite overwhelming constraints. Tonight, we're going to walk in their footsteps to understand their world from the inside. We'll explore the daily rhythms of convent life and see how desire found expression within rigid routines. We'll examine the theological debates that raged around women's sexuality and spirituality. We'll uncover the secret codes and hidden languages that allowed these relationships to flourish. And yes, we'll confront the brutal realities of what happened when these women were caught. This isn't just medieval history, it's a story about power, control, desire, and resistance that echoes through every century, including our own. It's about what happens when institutions try to regulate the most intimate aspects of human experience. It's about the courage it takes to love in the face of impossible odds, and it's about the lengths to which people will go to preserve and protect the evidence of lives fully lived. So settle in, because we're about to enter a world where prayer and passion intertwined, where sacred and profane blurred into something entirely new, where women wrote their own rules for love and paid the price for their audacity. The secret sex lives of medieval nuns await, and trust me, the reality is far more complex, far more beautiful, and far more human than anything you've been told before. You step deeper into the convent now, past the main chapel where morning prayers have just concluded, and into the private quarters where the real stories unfold. The dormitory is a long, narrow room, lined with simple wooden beds, each separated by thin curtains that provide the illusion of privacy but little else. This is where Sister Catherine first laid eyes on Sister Helene, and where their story began to unfold in whispered conversations after the evening bell. Catherine had arrived at the convent of St. Clare as a young woman of 19, sent there by a father who couldn't afford the dowry demanded by suitable husbands. She was educated, having learned to read and write from a tutor before her family's fortunes declined, and she possessed what her confessors would later describe as a dangerous curiosity about the world beyond convent walls. Helene, 3 years her senior, had been at the convent since childhood, raised by the nuns after her mother died in childbirth, and her father remarried a woman who wanted no reminders of his previous life. What drew them together initially was not romantic attraction, but intellectual hunger. Both women had been assigned to the scriptorium, the room where manuscripts were copied and illuminated, one of the few places in the convent where creativity was not just permitted but encouraged. It was there, bent over ancient texts in the flickering candlelight, that they began to share more than just their work. The historical record tells us that medieval scriptoriums were often hotbeds of intellectual and emotional intensity. Women who had been denied formal education anywhere else found themselves immersed in philosophy, theology, poetry, and classical literature. They copied the works of ancient writers, the mystical visions of female saints, and yes, sometimes the love poetry of troubadours. As they worked, they talked, and as they talked, they discovered minds that matched their own. For Catherine and Helene, those conversations quickly moved beyond the theological. They began leaving notes for each other, hidden in the bindings of books, pressed flowers between pages as tokens of affection, and developing their own private interpretation of the religious texts they copied daily. When Catherine wrote in the margins of a psalm about the soul's longing for God, Helene understood that the words carried a double meaning, but the scriptorium was not a private space. Other sisters worked there. The Mother Superior made regular inspections, and the chaplain often lingered to oversee their work. So Catherine and Helene developed what many couples in similar situations created, a secret language that could hide in plain sight. They spoke in biblical metaphors that carried personal meaning. When Catherine spoke of Ruth's devotion to Naomi during community prayers, Helene knew she was being told, "Whither thou goest, I will go." When Helene referenced the Song of Songs in casual conversation, Catherine understood the erotic undertones that medieval theologians tried desperately to interpret as purely spiritual. They learned to communicate through glances, through the arrangement of items on their work tables, through the timing of their arrivals and departures. The genius of their system was that it operated within the accepted framework of religious devotion. No one questioned nuns who spoke passionately about divine love, who seemed deeply moved by scriptural passages about spiritual union, who spent long hours in what appeared to be contemplative prayer. The very language of medieval mysticism provided perfect cover for human desire. Consider the writings of medieval mystics like Marguerite Porete or Hadewijk of Antwerp, whose descriptions of divine love were so sensual, so physically explicit, that they walk a razor's edge between the sacred and the erotic. These women wrote about being consumed by divine fire, about spiritual union that left them breathless and trembling, about a love so intense it transcended earthly understanding. When read today, their works sound remarkably like love letters disguised as theology. Catherine and Helene weren't unique in appropriating this language for their own purposes. Across medieval Europe, women in religious communities were discovering that mystical theology provided a vocabulary for experiences that had no other acceptable expression. They could write about burning desire, about longing that consumed them day and night, about union that brought ecstasy beyond description, and as long as they attributed these feelings to God, they remained within the bounds of orthodoxy, but vocabulary was just the beginning. These women also had to create opportunities for physical intimacy within the rigid structure of convent life. The daily schedule left little room for privacy. Prayers began before dawn, work continued through the day, meals were communal, and even sleep was supervised. Every moment was accounted for, every activity monitored. Yet lovers found ways. The garden became a crucial space, particularly the herb garden, where sisters were often sent to gather plants for the infirmary. The winding paths between raised beds, shielded by tall plants and hidden from the main buildings, provided precious moments of solitude. It was there that Catherine first took Helene's hand, ostensibly to examine a medicinal herb, but really to feel the warmth of skin against skin. The library too offered opportunities. Late evening study was permitted for those working on special projects, and the tall shelves created alcoves where whispered conversations could take place without being overheard. The scriptorium after hours, when most sisters had retired to their cells, became a meeting place where intellectual collaboration could shade into emotional intimacy. Even the chapel, the most sacred and supervised space in the convent, could be transformed into a place of secret communication. The long hours of communal prayer provided opportunities for meaningful glances, for positioning themselves where they could see each other during services, for the subtle communication that lovers develop when words are forbidden, but perhaps most importantly, they learn to use the structure of religious life itself as a shield for their relationship. Medieval convents encouraged intense spiritual friendships between sisters. These relationships, known as particular friendships, were meant to provide emotional support and spiritual guidance within the community. The Church recognized that women living in close quarters for decades needed deep emotional connections to maintain their psychological well-being. The line between acceptable spiritual friendship and forbidden romantic love was deliberately kept vague. This ambiguity allowed relationships like Catherine and Helene's to flourish in a grey area where passionate devotion could be interpreted as either deeply holy or dangerously carnal, depending on who was doing the interpreting and what they chose to see. Letters between medieval nuns that survive in various archives reveal the intensity of these relationships. They write of missing each other during brief separations, of finding comfort in shared prayer, of spiritual experiences that seem to depend on the presence of their beloved friend. The language is passionate, intimate, sometimes even possessive, yet it remains carefully within the bounds of acceptable religious discourse. What makes these documents so fascinating to modern readers is their emotional authenticity. These weren't women writing for public consumption or trying to create acceptable public images. These were private communications between people who loved each other, and the depth of feeling comes through despite the careful religious camouflage. Catherine and Helene's relationship deepened over months and years. They developed rituals that belonged only to them, private ceremonies that sacralized their bond while remaining invisible to outside observers. They would meet in the garden at sunset to pray together, their prayers gradually becoming conversations, their conversations becoming confessions of love. They created a private altar in a hidden corner of the scriptorium, decorated with flowers, and illuminated texts that held special meaning for them alone. The physical dimension of their relationship developed slowly, carefully, always with an awareness of the enormous risks they were taking. A hand brushed against a hand while reaching for the same book. A moment of comfort during a difficult day that lasted longer than strictly appropriate. Gradually, these small intimacies grew into something that would have scandalized their superiors and potentially destroyed their lives if discovered. Yet they weren't reckless. Both women understood the consequences of being caught in a physical relationship. They had heard the stories of nuns who had been publicly humiliated, excommunicated, or worse. They knew that their love existed in constant tension with their safety, that every moment of intimacy was a calculated risk. This tension between desire and danger created its own intensity. When every touch was forbidden, every touch became precious. When every moment together was stolen from a system designed to keep them apart, those moments carried a weight and significance that ordinary relationships might never achieve. Their love was heightened by its impossibility, deepened by its secrecy, made more precious by the knowledge that it could be taken away at any moment. The psychological toll of maintaining such a relationship was enormous. Both women lived in constant fear of discovery, constantly monitoring their behaviour for signs that might betray them, constantly passing the words and actions of others for hints of suspicion. They developed what we might now recognise as hypervigilance, an exhausting state of permanent alertness that affected every aspect of their lives. Yet they also developed remarkable resilience and creativity. They learned to find joy in the smallest gestures, to communicate volumes with a single glance, to create intimacy within constraints that would have defeated less determined lovers. They became experts at reading each other's moods and needs, at providing comfort and support through subtle means that escaped detection. Their story, like so many others hidden in the archives of medieval convents, challenges our assumptions about medieval sexuality, about religious life, and about the possibilities for love and resistance within oppressive systems. These weren't women who simply succumbed to temptation or abandoned their spiritual commitments. They were women who found ways to honour both their human needs and their religious calling, who created new forms of devotion that encompassed both divine and human love. The record suggests that relationships like theirs were far more common than official church histories would have us believe. Across Europe, in convents large and small, women were forming intense emotional and physical bonds that sustained them through lives of enforced isolation and rigid discipline. They created underground networks of support, shared knowledge about everything, from contraceptive herbs to techniques for avoiding detection, and developed sophisticated theological justifications for their relationships. But the story of Catherine and Helene, like so many others, was destined for a reckoning. The very intensity that made their love precious also made it visible to those trained to watch for signs of particular friendships that had crossed the line into forbidden territory. And when that reckoning came, it would test not just their love for each other, but their courage, their faith, and their will to survive in a world that demanded they choose between their humanity and their salvation. The investigation began, as these things often did, with a single moment of carelessness. Sister Marguerite, the elderly nun responsible for supervising the scriptorium, had noticed that certain manuscripts were taking longer to complete than they should. More troubling still, she had observed Catherine and Helene exchanging what appeared to be meaningful glances during the copying of a particularly sensual passage from the Song of Songs. But it wasn't suspicion that ultimately exposed them. It was jealousy. Sister Beatrice had arrived at the convent 2 years after Catherine, a young woman of noble birth whose family had sent her there, not from financial necessity, but from political convenience. She possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that made her both a valuable asset to the community and a potential threat to its harmony. From the moment she entered the scriptorium and witnessed the subtle intimacy between Catherine and Helene, she understood exactly what she was seeing. For months Beatrice watched and waited. She noted the way Catherine's handwriting became more elaborate when Helene was working nearby. She observed how the two women somehow always managed to be assigned to the same projects, despite the Mother Superior's policy of rotating partnerships to prevent exactly these kinds of attachments. Most damning of all, she discovered the pressed flowers hidden between the pages of manuscripts, the marginalia that seemed to carry double meanings, the entire secret language that Catherine and Helene had created. But Beatrice wasn't motivated by religious zeal or concern for the moral purity of the convent. She was motivated by something far more human and recognisable. She wanted Catherine for herself. The dynamics of desire in medieval convents were far more complex than simple romantic attraction between two people. These were closed communities where women lived together for decades, where emotional and physical needs had to be met within a very limited pool of potential partners. Jealousy, competition, and unrequited love were as common as devotion and prayer. Beatrice began her campaign subtly. She volunteered for tasks that would place her in Catherine's proximity. She offered assistance with difficult copying projects. She began leaving her own tokens of affection, carefully disguised as spiritual offerings. When Catherine failed to respond to these overtures with anything more than polite gratitude, Beatrice's frustration grew into something darker. The breaking point came during the feast of St. Agnes, the patron saint of chastity and purity. The entire convent was engaged in special prayers and celebrations, and the normal routine was suspended for 3 days of intensive spiritual observance. It was during this period of heightened religious fervour that Beatrice chose to make her accusation. She approached Mother Superior Clotilde during the private audience that followed evening prayers, her face composed in an expression of pious concern. The conversation, as recorded in the convent's disciplinary records, began with Beatrice expressing worry about the spiritual welfare of her sisters. She spoke of observing behaviours that seemed inconsistent with their vows, of relationships that appeared to have crossed the boundaries of appropriate spiritual friendship. Mother Superior Clotilde was no fool. She had governed the convent of St. Clair for over 15 years, and she understood the realities of managing a community of women who had been forced into religious life regardless of their personal inclinations. She knew that intense friendships were inevitable, even necessary for maintaining psychological stability. She also knew that some of these friendships inevitably developed into something more. Her policy, unwritten but understood by the senior nuns, was one of strategic blindness. As long as relationships remained discreet, as long as they didn't disrupt the community or create obvious scandal, she was prepared to overlook what she couldn't officially acknowledge. This pragmatic approach had served the convent well, maintaining peace and stability while allowing the women under her care to find the emotional sustenance they needed to endure their confined lives. But Beatrice's accusation was too specific, too detailed to ignore. She presented evidence, the pressed flowers, the meaningful glances, the suspicious amount of time Catherine and Helene spent together in supposedly work-related activities. Most damaging of all, she claimed to have witnessed physical intimacy between the two women in the herb garden after evening prayers. Mother Superior Clotilde found herself in an impossible position. If she ignored the accusation and words somehow reached the bishop or the papal authorities, the entire convent could face investigation and dissolution. The church had become increasingly suspicious of female religious communities, particularly those that seemed to operate with too much independence. Recent scandals at other convents had resulted in mass expulsions, the seizure of property, and the dispersal of communities that had existed for centuries. But if she acted on Beatrice's accusation, she would be destroying two of her most valuable sisters and potentially destabilizing the entire community. Catherine and Helene were not just lovers, they were leaders whose intelligence and dedication had made them essential to the convent's operations. They managed the scriptorium, oversaw the education of novices, and served as informal counselors to younger sisters struggling with the demands of religious life. The investigation that followed was conducted with the kind of methodical thoroughness that the Church had perfected over centuries of rooting out heresy and moral corruption. Mother Superior Clotilde, bound by canonical law, had no choice but to follow established procedures. Catherine and Helene were separated immediately, confined to individual cells, and forbidden from speaking to each other or to any other members of the community except during formal interrogation. The questioning began at dawn and continued for hours each day. Church investigators trained in the techniques of extracting confessions employed a combination of theological intimidation, psychological pressure, and carefully orchestrated isolation to break down their subjects' resistance. They asked detailed questions about the nature of the relationship, demanded specifics about physical contact, and repeatedly emphasized the eternal consequences of lying to church authorities. Catherine, the younger and perhaps more vulnerable of the two, was the first to break. Under relentless questioning about her spiritual state and repeated warnings about the fate of her immortal soul, she admitted to feelings of love for Helene that went beyond appropriate spiritual friendship. But even in her confession, she maintained that their relationship had been primarily emotional and intellectual, that any physical contact had been minimal and motivated by spiritual rather than carnal desire. Helene's interrogation proved more challenging for the investigators. 3 years older and more experienced in the ways of the convent, she understood better how to navigate the theological and legal complexities of their situation. She admitted to deep affection for Catherine, but framed it entirely in terms of spiritual mentorship and sisterly love. When pressed about specific incidents of physical contact, she provided explanations that, while perhaps not entirely convincing, remained within the bounds of plausible spiritual justification. The investigators found themselves facing a common problem in cases involving religious communities. The line between acceptable spiritual intimacy and forbidden carnal relationship was genuinely ambiguous. Medieval theology recognized that intense spiritual friendships were not only normal, but necessary for religious development. The same physical gestures and emotional expressions that might indicate carnal desire in the secular world could be interpreted as signs of spiritual maturity in a religious context. Complicating matters further was the question of evidence. Unlike cases involving heterosexual relationships, where pregnancy or witness testimony might provide clear proof of sexual contact, relationships between women left few traces that could be definitively interpreted. The pressed flowers, the marginalia, the stolen moments of privacy could all be explained as expressions of spiritual friendship rather than romantic love. The theological debates that raged around cases like this reveal the deep contradictions within medieval Christianity's approach to female sexuality and spirituality. On one hand, the Church promoted the idea that women were naturally more spiritual than men, more capable of direct mystical experience, more suited to lives of religious devotion. On the other hand, it maintained that women were also more susceptible to carnal temptation, less able to control their physical desires, more likely to lead others into sin. These contradictory beliefs created an impossible standard for women in religious communities. They were expected to achieve levels of spiritual intimacy and emotional vulnerability that would naturally lead to intense personal relationships, but they were forbidden from expressing those relationships in any way that might be interpreted as physical or romantic. They were encouraged to love deeply, but punished for loving too specifically. The case of Catherine and Helene dragged on for weeks, creating enormous tension within the convent community. Other sisters, aware that their own relationships might come under scrutiny, began to modify their behaviour, withdrawing from friendships that had sustained them for years. The atmosphere of trust and mutual support that had characterised the community was replaced by suspicion and fear. Some sisters rallied to Catherine and Helene's defence, though they had to be careful about how they expressed their support. They testified to the women's spiritual devotion, their dedication to their work, their positive influence on younger sisters. They emphasised the intellectual and artistic contributions both women had made to the community, arguing that their relationship had enhanced rather than undermined their religious commitment. Others, perhaps motivated by their own fears or jealousies, provided testimony that supported the accusations. They spoke of observing suspicious behaviour, of sensing something inappropriate in the relationship, of concerns about the example being set for younger sisters. The community that had once been united began to fracture along lines of loyalty and self-preservation. Meanwhile, word of the investigation began to spread beyond the convent walls. The local bishop, already concerned about maintaining his reputation in an era of increased papal scrutiny, felt pressure to demonstrate his commitment to moral purity. Representatives from Rome began making inquiries about the situation, adding another layer of political complexity to what had begun as a simple disciplinary matter. The punishment, when it finally came, reflected the impossible position in which the Church found itself. Catherine and Helene could not be completely exonerated without appearing to condone relationships that might encourage similar behaviour in other communities. But they could not be severely punished without acknowledging that such relationships were common enough in religious communities to pose a genuine threat to church authority. The sentence was a masterpiece of ecclesiastical compromise. Both women were found guilty of excessive particular friendship that had interfered with their spiritual development and their service to the community. They were sentenced to 6 months of separation, during which they would engage in intensive spiritual counselling and penance. After this period, they would be allowed to remain in the community, but would never again be permitted to work together or engage in private conversation. Catherine was transferred to the convent's infirmary, where she would serve under the supervision of Sister Martha, an elderly nun known for her strict interpretation of religious discipline. Helene was assigned to the kitchen, a position that would keep her occupied with practical tasks and limit her contact with the intellectual pursuits that had brought her and Catherine together. The punishment was designed to be corrective rather than destructive, to separate the women without completely destroying their lives or their commitment to religious service. But for Catherine and Helene, the separation was devastating. They had built their entire emotional and spiritual lives around their relationship, and its sudden termination left them both struggling to find meaning and purpose in their daily existence. Yet even in separation, they found ways to maintain connection. Messages passed through sympathetic sisters, prayers offered at specific times that each knew the other would recognize, flowers left in places where they might be found and understood. Their love, forced underground, became even more precious for its impossibility. The aftermath of their case reverberated through the convent for years. Some sisters became more cautious about forming close relationships, fearful that their friendships might be misinterpreted or used against them. Others became more defiant, determined to protect the emotional bonds that made their confined lives bearable. The community learned to operate with a new level of secrecy and mutual protection, developing more sophisticated methods for concealing relationships that might attract unwanted attention. But perhaps most significantly, the case of Catherine and Helene became part of the hidden, oral tradition that passed knowledge from older sisters to younger ones. New arrivals learned not just the official rules of convent life, but the unwritten codes that governed relationships between women. They learned how to recognize the signs of romantic attachment, how to provide cover for couples who needed privacy, how to protect themselves and others from the kind of investigation that had torn apart Catherine and Helene's world. The story didn't end with their separation, of course. Love once kindled doesn't extinguish easily, even under the weight of institutional oppression. Catherine and Helene would spend the next several years learning to navigate their transformed relationship, finding new ways to express their devotion within the constraints imposed upon them. Their story became both a cautionary tale and an inspiration for other women facing similar challenges, and they were far from alone. Across medieval Europe, in convents and monasteries, in beguinages and religious communities of every description, women and men were writing similar stories of love, discovered, challenged, and transformed by the institutions meant to contain them. Each case was unique in its details, but universal in its fundamental human truths, that love finds a way, that desire cannot be legislated away, and that the human heart will always seek connection, even in the most unlikely and forbidden circumstances. The secret sex lives of medieval nuns were not just about sex, though sexuality was certainly part of their story. They were about the full spectrum of human intimacy, about the ways that people create meaning and connection within systems designed to prevent exactly those things. They were about resistance and adaptation, about the courage to love in the face of overwhelming consequences, and about the endless human capacity to find hope and beauty even in the darkest circumstances. The investigation into Catherine and Helene's relationship had created ripples that spread far beyond their individual fate. Other convents began receiving visits from church officials, unannounced inspections designed to root out similar irregularities. The atmosphere of fear was palpable, but it also sparked something unexpected: innovation. Sister Agnes, who had served as the convent's librarian for over 2 decades, understood that the community's survival depended on protecting its members from future scrutiny. She began developing what could only be described as an early warning system, a network of signals and codes that would alert sisters to potential danger before it arrived at their doors. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Certain books placed in specific positions on reading stands indicated that visitors were approaching. Particular flowers arranged in chapel vases warned of increased surveillance. Even the way sisters arranged their prayer beads could communicate vital information about who was watching and when it was safe to speak freely. But Agnes understood that protection required more than just early warning. It required the systematic preservation of the community's hidden history, the stories and knowledge that the Church was so determined to erase. She began creating what we might now call an underground archive, carefully copying and concealing documents that recorded the real lives of the women who had called the convent home. Hidden compartments were carved into the walls behind religious paintings. False bottoms were constructed in storage chests. Even prayer books were hollowed out to create hiding places for letters, poems, and personal accounts that told stories the official records would never acknowledge. Agnes worked alone, trusting no one with the full scope of her project, understanding that the safety of future generations might depend on preserving evidence of lives that the Church preferred to pretend had never existed. The sophistication of these concealment methods reveals something crucial about medieval women's communities. These weren't passive victims of Church oppression. They were active agents who developed complex strategies for resistance and survival. They understood that their battle wasn't just against individual prejudice or temporary persecution, but against a systematic effort to control and define their existence. The theological justifications they developed for their relationships were equally sophisticated. Drawing on the rich tradition of mystical writing, women like Sister Matilda began crafting interpretations of religious doctrine that created space for the kinds of love the Church condemned. They argued that divine love manifested itself through human relationships, that spiritual union could be achieved through physical intimacy, that the body itself was a sacred text to be read and understood. These weren't desperate rationalizations created to justify forbidden behavior. They were carefully reasoned theological positions that drew on centuries of Christian thought. The women who developed them were often highly educated, fluent in Latin, familiar with the works of Augustine and Aquinas, capable of engaging in sophisticated philosophical debate. They used their intellectual training not to submit to Church authority, but to challenge it on its own terms. Consider the writings of Sister Perpetua, whose private notebook survived hidden in a wall cavity until their discovery in the 17th century. Her theological treatise on the nature of divine love reads like a carefully constructed argument for the spiritual validity of same-sex relationships. She drew on biblical passages, patristic writings, and mystical traditions to create a framework that elevated rather than condemned the love between women. Her central argument was revolutionary in its implications. If God created humans in divine image, she reasoned, then human love in all its forms must reflect divine love. If Christ's love for his disciples was both spiritual and physical, expressed through touch, through shared meals, through intimate conversation, then physical expressions of love between spiritual companions couldn't be inherently sinful. The sin lay not in loving, but in loving without spiritual purpose, in treating the body as separate from the soul rather than as an integral part of divine creation. These theological innovations spread through underground networks that connected convents across Europe. Letters passed between communities, carrying not just personal messages, but entire philosophical systems designed to support and justify the relationships that sustained these women's lives. A sister in France might develop an interpretation of a particular biblical passage that would find its way to convents in Germany or Italy, where it would be refined, expanded, and passed on to other communities. The Church, of course, was not unaware of these developments. Periodic crackdowns attempted to root out what officials termed theological irregularities, but the very nature of mystical writing made it difficult to distinguish between acceptable spiritual expression and dangerous innovation. The same language that Orthodox mystics used to describe their relationship with God could be employed to justify relationships between humans. This theological arms race created an atmosphere of constant tension and creativity within religious communities. Women had to become expert at walking the line between acceptable and forbidden expression, at crafting language that could carry multiple meanings depending on who was reading it. They developed a sophisticated understanding of religious rhetoric that allowed them to say dangerous things in safe ways. The economic dimensions of convent life also played a crucial role in shaping these relationships. Many convents were essentially independent economic entities, managing extensive properties, conducting business with the outside world, and wielding considerable financial power. The women who ran these institutions weren't powerless victims of male authority. They were skilled administrators, savvy negotiators, and formidable political actors. This economic independence created space for relationship patterns that would have been impossible in other contexts. Abbesses could protect their favourites from unwanted attention, assign them to positions that would keep them together, and use their authority to shield relationships from outside scrutiny. The financial resources of the convent could be deployed to purchase privacy, to fund travel that might separate potential lovers from their persecutors, or to provide comfortable accommodations for women whose relationships had brought them under suspicion. Sister Margot, who served as treasurer of her convent for over 30 years, left behind detailed financial records that reveal the sophisticated ways these communities protected their members. Payments to church officials that might ensure favourable treatment during inspections. Donations to local authorities that guaranteed advance warning of investigations. Even bribes to servants and lay workers who might otherwise report suspicious behaviour to outside authorities. These weren't isolated acts of corruption. They were systematic strategies developed by women who understood that their survival depended on managing the economic and political forces that shaped their world. They used their financial resources as weapons in a broader struggle for autonomy and self-determination. The artistic and intellectual achievements of these communities also served as forms of resistance. The illuminated manuscripts produced in convent scriptoriums weren't just religious texts. They were vehicles for expressing ideas and emotions that couldn't be safely communicated in other ways. Hidden in the margins of psalm books and prayer collections were images and symbols that carried personal meaning for their creators. A particular way of drawing hands might reference a private joke between lovers. The choice of colours in a religious illustration could carry coded messages about relationships within the community. Even the selection of text to be copied reflected the intellectual and emotional lives of the women doing the copying. When Sister Isabella chose to copy a collection of love poetry attributed to ancient Christian martyrs, she wasn't just preserving religious literature. She was creating a resource that future generations of women could use to understand and justify their own feelings. The musical traditions of these communities served similar functions. Liturgical music provided cover for compositions that carried personal meaning. Harmonies could be arranged to highlight particular voices, creating moments of musical intimacy within formal religious services. Even the timing of musical performances could be used to communicate with specific individuals in the congregation. Some of the most beautiful musical compositions of the medieval period emerge from these communities. The complex polyphonic works created by nuns like Hildegard of Bingen weren't just expressions of religious devotion. They were sophisticated artistic achievements that demonstrated the intellectual and creative capabilities of women who were supposedly confined to lives of simple prayer and domestic labour. The educational functions of convents created another layer of complexity in these relationships. Many communities served as schools for young women from wealthy families, creating environments where adolescent and adult women lived in close proximity for extended periods. The relationships that developed between teachers and students, between older and younger sisters, often carried both educational and emotional dimensions that were difficult to categorize according to church regulations. Sister Veronica, who served as mistress of novices for 15 years, left behind a collection of letters to her former students that reveal the intensity of these mentor relationships. Her correspondence with young women who had left the convent to marry or to join other communities reads like the letters of a devoted parent or passionate friend. She followed their lives with intense interest, offered advice on everything from marriage to child rearing, and maintained emotional connections that lasted for decades. These relationships weren't necessarily sexual, but they were certainly intimate in ways that transcended the boundaries the Church tried to establish between appropriate and inappropriate attachment. They created networks of loyalty and affection that bound women together across geographical and temporal distances, creating what amounted to alternative families based on choice rather than blood. The medical knowledge possessed by many nuns also gave them unique insights into female sexuality and reproduction. The convent infirmary wasn't just a place where sick sisters received care. It was often a centre of medical knowledge where women learned about their bodies, about contraception, about pregnancy and childbirth, about the treatment of diseases that male physicians preferred not to discuss. Sister Ursula, who served as infirmarian at her convent for over 20 years, left behind detailed medical notes that reveal sophisticated understanding of female anatomy and sexuality. Her treatments for what she termed disorders of melancholy included recommendations for physical exercise, dietary changes, and what she delicately referred to as practices for the relief of bodily tension. Modern readers can recognize these as early forms of sex therapy, designed to address the psychological and physical consequences of enforced celibacy. This medical knowledge gave women tools for managing their relationships in ways that reduced the risk of pregnancy or disease. It also provided them with scientific understanding that challenged church teachings about female sexuality. When you understand the actual mechanics of reproduction, it becomes harder to accept theological arguments that treat female desire as inherently sinful or dangerous. The networks of communication that connected these communities extended far beyond the exchange of letters or the movement of individuals between convents. They included systems for sharing medical knowledge, theological innovations, artistic techniques, and practical strategies for survival. A technique for hiding contraband developed in one community might spread across an entire region within months. A theological argument that provided protection for forbidden relationships in one location would quickly find its way to women facing similar challenges elsewhere. These networks operated with remarkable efficiency, despite the limitations of medieval communication technology. They relied on the movement of pilgrims, merchants, and religious officials who could carry messages between communities. They used the church's own communication systems to spread information that the church would have suppressed if it had understood what was being transmitted. The resilience of these networks is demonstrated by their ability to survive periodic crackdowns and investigations. When one communication route was compromised, others would quickly develop to replace it. When key individuals were removed from their positions, their knowledge and connections would be preserved by others who stepped forward to maintain the system. Perhaps most remarkably, these networks managed to preserve their essential functions, even as the political and religious landscape of Europe underwent dramatic changes. The Protestant Reformation, which dissolved many Catholic convents and scattered their communities, might have been expected to destroy these underground systems entirely. Instead, they adapted, finding new forms and new locations where women could continue to support each other and preserve the knowledge and traditions that had sustained them for centuries. The legacy of these medieval relationships extends far beyond their immediate historical context. They demonstrate that human sexuality and emotional needs cannot be suppressed by institutional authority, no matter how powerful or determined that authority might be. They show us that women throughout history have found ways to claim agency over their own lives and relationships, even within systems designed to deny them that agency. They also reveal the sophisticated intellectual and theological work that women did to justify and protect their relationships. These weren't simple acts of rebellion against religious authority. They were complex negotiations with religious tradition that created new forms of spiritual understanding and practice. The courage required to maintain these relationships in the face of such enormous risks speaks to something fundamental about human nature. Love, it seems, really is stronger than fear, stronger than institutional oppression, stronger even than the threat of eternal damnation. The women who chose to love within these constraints weren't just satisfying personal desires, they were making profound statements about the value of human connection and the importance of emotional authenticity. Their stories also challenge our assumptions about medieval sexuality and spirituality. They show us that the Middle Ages weren't simply a period of repression and ignorance, but a time of complex negotiations between human needs and institutional demands. They reveal that women in particular found creative ways to express their sexuality and form meaningful relationships despite enormous constraints. As we move deeper into their world, we begin to understand that the secret sex lives of medieval nuns weren't just about individual relationships or personal desires. They were about creating alternative forms of community and spirituality that honoured both human needs and divine calling. They were about resistance and adaptation, about the endless human capacity to find hope and beauty, even in the most restrictive circumstances. The documents and artifacts that survived from these communities provide us with invaluable insights into the lived experiences of women who have been largely erased from official histories. They remind us that behind every institutional narrative, there are human stories of love, loss, courage, and creativity that deserve to be remembered and honoured. But the story we've been following is far from over. The investigation into Catherine and Helene's relationship was just the beginning of a much larger transformation within their community. The fear and suspicion it generated would force every woman in the convent to make difficult choices about how to live, how to love, and how to survive in a world that seemed determined to deny their humanity. The ripple effects of the investigation spread through the convent like spilled ink across parchment, staining everything it touched. Within weeks, what had once been a community bound by shared purpose and mutual support began to fracture along invisible lines of fear and suspicion. Sisters who had shared confidences for years suddenly found themselves watching their words, measuring their glances, questioning whether their closest friendships might be interpreted as something more dangerous. Sister Judith, who had served as the convent's herbalist for nearly a decade, found herself particularly vulnerable to this new atmosphere of scrutiny. Her work required her to spend long hours alone with other sisters, treating ailments that ranged from simple headaches to more intimate feminine complaints. The privacy these consultations required had always been respected, understood as necessary for both medical effectiveness and personal dignity. But now, every closed door became suspect, every whispered conversation a potential sign of impropriety. The irony wasn't lost on the more observant sisters. The very intimacy that the Church promoted as spiritual ideal became dangerous when it manifested between women rather than between a woman and her divine bridegroom. The passionate language of mystical union that filled their prayer books and devotional texts suddenly seemed fraught with peril when applied to human relationships. Sister Judith understood this paradox better than most. Her medical training had given her insights into the female body that went far beyond what most of her sisters possessed. She knew that the physical symptoms many of them brought to her, the mysterious aches and sleepless nights, the periods of melancholy and restless energy, were often the body's response to enforced isolation from human touch and affection. Her treatment methods, developed over years of careful observation and discreet experimentation, included techniques that would have horrified church authorities if they had understood their true nature. She prescribed specific exercises for sisters suffering from what she privately termed disorders of solitude. She recommended particular dietary supplements that helped balance the humours disrupted by emotional stress. Most controversially, she taught selected sisters methods of self-care that addressed physical needs the Church preferred to pretend didn't exist. These treatments were never discussed openly, never recorded in official medical records. They were passed from woman to woman through whispered conversations in the herb garden, through carefully coded instructions hidden in recipe collections, through the kind of intimate knowledge sharing that created bonds between healer and patient that transcended the formal boundaries of religious life. But in the new atmosphere of suspicion that followed Catherine and Helene's disgrace, even these carefully guarded practices became dangerous. Sister Judith found herself second-guessing every interaction, wondering if her willingness to discuss intimate matters with her patients might be misinterpreted as something more personal than professional. The transformation was particularly evident in the younger sisters, the novices and recent arrivals who had not yet learned the subtle arts of concealment that protected more experienced community members. Where once they had turned naturally to older sisters for guidance and comfort, they now maintained careful distances, afraid that seeking emotional support might be seen as evidence of inappropriate attachment. Sister Anne, barely 18 and struggling with homesickness that made her physically ill, had previously found comfort in long conversations with Sister Margaret, a woman 15 years her senior who had shown maternal kindness during Anne's difficult adjustment to convent life. But now those conversations had ceased, replaced by formal interactions that left both women feeling isolated and bereft. The absence of these supportive relationships created its own problems. Young women who might have been guided through the emotional challenges of religious life by caring mentors instead found themselves adrift, vulnerable to the kind of depression and despair that could lead to far more serious transgressions than secret friendships. The cure, it seemed, was proving worse than the disease. Mother Superior Clotilde watched these developments with growing concern. Her years of experience had taught her that communities built on fear and suspicion were ultimately unsustainable. Women who couldn't trust each other, who couldn't form the emotional bonds necessary for mutual support, would either leave the religious life entirely or develop more serious problems that would eventually attract even more unwanted attention from church authorities. But she also understood that the political pressures on her community had intensified dramatically. The bishop had made it clear that any further incidents would result in direct papal intervention, possibly including the dissolution of the convent and the dispersal of its members to other institutions. The economic consequences alone would be devastating, but the human cost would be even greater. The solution she devised was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than attempting to eliminate emotional bonds between sisters, she would create structures that channeled those bonds in directions that appeared more acceptable to outside observers. She instituted a formal system of spiritual mentorship that paired older sisters with younger ones, providing official sanction for relationships that had previously existed in a grey area of institutional ambiguity. The new system included specific guidelines for appropriate interaction between mentors and protégés. Regular meetings were scheduled and supervised. Written reports were required, documenting the spiritual progress of younger sisters under the guidance of their assigned mentors. The entire process was formalized, bureaucratized, made visible to anyone who might question the propriety of close relationships between community members. But like most institutional attempts to regulate human emotion, the system created as many problems as it solved. The artificial pairing of women who might have no natural affinity for each other led to awkward, stilted relationships that satisfied neither partner. Meanwhile, women who had developed genuine connections were often separated by the new assignments, forced to conduct their friendships in secret or abandon them entirely. Sister Rosalind, who had been paired with a novice whose personality clashed dramatically with her own, found herself longing for the easy companionship she had previously enjoyed with Sister Patricia, a woman whose intellectual curiosity matched her own, and whose sense of humour had sustained them both through difficult periods. The official mentorship duties consumed time and energy that had previously been devoted to the relationship that actually nourished her spirit. The formalization of relationships also created new opportunities for manipulation and abuse. Sisters who understood how to work within the system could use their positions as official mentors to gain access to younger women who might otherwise have been protected by community oversight. The very structure designed to prevent inappropriate relationships could be twisted to enable them. More troubling still was the way the new system encouraged a culture of surveillance and reporting. Mentors were expected to document not just the spiritual progress of their assigned protégé, but any signs of emotional instability, inappropriate attachments, or resistance to guidance. The informal networks of mutual protection that had previously shielded vulnerable community members from institutional scrutiny were replaced by formal reporting structures that made concealment much more difficult. Sister Euphemia, who had served as an unofficial counsellor to sisters struggling with doubt or despair, found that her role had been effectively eliminated. Women who might once have sought her guidance now feared that confiding their struggles would result in official documentation that could be used against them. The healing conversations that had helped so many sisters navigate the challenges of religious life became impossible to conduct safely. The intellectual life of the community suffered as well. The scriptorium, once a place of collaborative creativity where sisters worked together on illuminated manuscripts and scholarly projects, became a site of careful isolation. The marginalia that had once carried personal messages between copyists disappeared, replaced by strictly orthodox commentary that revealed nothing of the personalities behind the pen. The theological discussions that had flourished in the library were replaced by silent study periods supervised by senior sisters, tasked with monitoring conversations for signs of doctrinal irregularity. The innovative interpretations of religious texts that had helped women understand their experiences within a spiritual framework gave way to rote recitation of approved authorities. Sister Scholastica, whose brilliant commentary on the writings of early church fathers had been quietly celebrated within the community, found herself unable to continue her scholarly work. The question she raised about the nature of divine love, the role of physical experience in spiritual development, and the relationship between human and celestial marriage had once been welcomed as evidence of intellectual sophistication. Now, they were viewed as potentially dangerous challenges to orthodox teaching. The artistic output of the community declined as well. The beautiful, illuminated manuscripts that had once emerged from the convent's workshops became mechanically perfect but emotionally sterile. The personal touches that had made each piece unique, the subtle expressions of individual creativity and emotion, were eliminated in favour of standardised designs that could not be misinterpreted. Music, too, suffered under the new regime. The complex harmonies that had once allowed sisters to communicate through sound, to express emotions that words could not safely convey, were simplified into unison, chanting that permitted no individual expression. The musical innovations that had made the convent's liturgical services renowned throughout the region disappeared, replaced by strictly traditional forms that satisfied church authorities but left the performers feeling spiritually impoverished. The economic activities of the convent were similarly affected. The business relationships that had previously been managed through personal connections between sisters and their contacts in the outside world became formalized and distant. The trust that had enabled profitable partnerships with merchants, landowners, and other religious communities was undermined by the perception that the convent could no longer be relied upon to maintain internal discipline. Trade agreements that had been negotiated through years of careful relationship building suddenly came under scrutiny. Partners who had once valued the personal guarantees of individual sisters now demanded formal contracts and institutional oversight. The financial independence that had protected the community from external pressure began to erode as economic relationships became more precarious. The medical services that sisters like Judith had provided to the broader community also came under restriction. Local women who had once sought treatment for intimate ailments from nuns known for their discretion and expertise found themselves turned away or subjected to formal procedures that eliminated the privacy they required. The informal networks of healthcare that had served rural communities for generations began to fracture. These changes had profound implications for the convent's relationship with the surrounding population. The sisters had long served not just as spiritual advisors, but as counsellors, mediators, and sources of practical assistance for local families. Their withdrawal from these roles left a vacuum that was difficult to fill, creating resentment among people who had depended on their services. The political consequences were equally serious. The convent had traditionally played an important role in local governance, with the Mother Superior serving as an unofficial advisor to secular authorities on matters ranging from land disputes to marriage arrangements. The institution's loss of credibility made it difficult to maintain these influential relationships. But perhaps most damaging of all was the psychological toll on the sisters themselves. Women who had found meaning and purpose in their relationships with each other discovered that the very connections that had sustained them were now sources of danger. The emotional support systems that had made religious life bearable were dismantled, leaving individual sisters to cope with isolation, doubt, and despair without the community networks that had previously provided comfort. The rate of departures from the convent increased dramatically in the months following the investigation. Some sisters requested transfers to other institutions, hoping to find communities where the atmosphere was less oppressive. Others sought dispensation from their vows entirely, choosing to return to secular life rather than continued living under constant surveillance. Those who remained often did so not from spiritual conviction, but from practical necessity. Women who had no family to return to, no economic resources to support independent life, no skills that would enable them to survive outside religious institutions, found themselves trapped in communities that no longer provided the emotional sustenance that had originally made religious life attractive. The irony was profound. In their effort to protect the spiritual purity of the convent, church authorities had created an environment that was fundamentally opposed to the spiritual growth and emotional well-being of its inhabitants. The cure had indeed proven worse than the disease, but the institutional momentum made it impossible to acknowledge this failure or to reverse course. Yet even within this transformed landscape, human nature continued to assert itself. The need for connection, for understanding, for emotional intimacy could not be legislated away, no matter how comprehensive the surveillance or how severe the punishments. New forms of relationship began to emerge, more carefully concealed, more creatively expressed, but no less real for their invisibility. Sisters developed elaborate systems of coded communication that operated entirely within the bounds of acceptable religious discourse. Particular ways of arranging prayer beads conveyed specific messages. The selection of hymns during private devotions carried meaning for those who knew how to interpret the choices. Even the timing of appearances in the chapel became a form of conversation. These new languages of love were necessarily more subtle, more abstract than their predecessors. They required greater sophistication to create and decode deeper understanding of both religious symbolism and human psychology. In some ways, they were more beautiful for their complexity, more precious for their fragility. The community that emerged from this period of transformation was fundamentally different from what had existed before. More cautious, certainly, but also more creative, more fearful, but also more resilient. The women who survived the purge had learned lessons about concealment and resistance that would serve them well in the decades to come. They had also learned something else equally important, that love, once experienced, could not be forgotten or eliminated, only driven deeper underground, where it might grow in new and unexpected directions. The investigation that was meant to eliminate inappropriate relationships had instead created a generation of women who understood more clearly than ever the value of what they were being asked to surrender. The seeds of future resistance had been planted, not destroyed, by the Church's attempts at control. And in the years that followed, those seeds would grow into networks of support and affection that would prove far more sophisticated and durable than anything that had existed before the crackdown began. The secret sex lives of medieval nuns were entering a new phase, one that would test the ingenuity and determination of women who had learned that survival sometimes required becoming invisible while remaining fully, defiantly human. The story was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning to unfold in directions that would surprise and challenge everyone involved. The years that followed the Great Investigation transformed the convent of St. Clair into something resembling a living chess game, where every move required careful calculation and every gesture carried the weight of potential discovery. Sister Catherine and Sister Helene, now separated by institutional decree, but not by choice, became unwitting architects of a new form of resistance that would influence religious communities across Europe for generations to come. Catherine, confined to the infirmary under Sister Martha's watchful eye, discovered that her enforced proximity to the sick and dying had given her an unexpected gift. The women who came to her for treatment, weakened by illness and stripped of their usual defences, spoke with a candour that healthy sisters could never risk. In their fevered confessions and pain-induced honesty, Catherine began to understand that her relationship with Helene was not an isolated aberration, but part of a vast underground network of love that connected women across the entire religious world. The stories that emerged from those sickbeds painted a picture of medieval religious life that would have astounded church authorities if they had possessed the courage to listen. Sister Agatha, delirious with lung fever, spoke of letters hidden in the binding of psalters, passed between convents through networks of travelling pilgrims. Sister Cordelia, weakened by the bloody flux, whispered about midnight meetings in herb gardens, where women shared not just medicinal knowledge, but intimate secrets that sustained them through decades of enforced isolation. Each revelation taught Catherine something new about the sophisticated systems that had evolved to protect forbidden relationships. She learned about the flower languages that allowed sisters to communicate across courtyards without speaking a word. She discovered the significance of particular embroidery patterns that could convey complex messages to those who understood their meaning. Most remarkably, she began to comprehend the theological innovations that women had developed to justify their relationships, not as violations of religious law, but as expressions of divine love in its purest form. Meanwhile, Helene's assignment to the kitchen had placed her at the centre of a different kind of information network. The constant flow of lay workers, delivery merchants, and visiting clergy through the kitchen created opportunities for gathering intelligence about conditions in other religious communities. Through careful questioning and discreet observation, she began to map the connections between convents across France, identifying institutions where relationships like theirs were tolerated or even quietly encouraged. The picture that emerged was both encouraging and sobering. While some communities had been devastated by investigations similar to their own, others had developed sophisticated protection systems that allowed forbidden relationships to flourish with minimal risk. The key, Helene discovered, lay not in avoiding suspicion entirely, but in managing it skillfully, creating alternative explanations for behaviours that might otherwise attract unwanted attention. She learned about convents where entire networks of relationships operated under the guise of spiritual mentorship programs that were far more flexible than the rigid system their own Mother Superior had instituted. She heard stories of communities where theological innovation had created space for physical expressions of divine love that would have been condemned as heretical in less creative institutions. Most intriguingly, she discovered that some convents had developed economic relationships with secular authorities that provided protection from ecclesiastical interference in exchange for discreet services that were never officially acknowledged. The information gathered by both women gradually coalesced into a comprehensive understanding of how religious communities across Europe were adapting to increased scrutiny from church authorities. What they discovered challenged every assumption about the isolation and powerlessness of medieval religious women. Far from being passive victims of institutional oppression, these communities were actively engaged in sophisticated forms of resistance that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The theological dimension of this resistance was particularly impressive. Women who had been denied formal education in philosophy and canon law had nonetheless developed complex arguments that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between physical and spiritual love. Drawing on mystical traditions, biblical scholarship, and their own lived experiences, they created intellectual frameworks that provided religious justification for relationships that official church doctrine condemned. Sister Perpetua's hidden notebooks, which had somehow survived discovery during the investigation, contained the most sophisticated example of this theological innovation that Catherine had ever encountered. Her argument that divine love necessarily manifested itself through human relationships was supported by extensive citations from approved religious authorities, carefully selected and interpreted to support conclusions that those authorities would never have endorsed. The economic dimensions of resistance were equally sophisticated. Convents that appeared to operate in complete submission to church authority were in fact maintaining complex webs of financial relationships that provided them with considerable independence. They invested in property, lent money to secular authorities, and engaged in trade relationships that generated income streams beyond the reach of ecclesiastical oversight. This economic independence created space for the kind of institutional autonomy that made protection of forbidden relationships possible. A convent with substantial financial resources could afford to maintain larger staffs, creating opportunities for privacy that would be impossible in smaller, more closely supervised communities. They could also afford to provide generous hospitality to church officials, creating goodwill that might prove valuable when discretion was required. The political dimensions were perhaps most complex of all. Many convents had developed relationships with secular authorities that provided mutual benefits while creating alternative sources of protection from purely ecclesiastical pressure. Local nobles who valued the economic contributions of religious communities or who had family members within them could be counted on to resist papal interference that might disrupt profitable arrangements. These protective relationships required careful management and constant attention. Abbesses had to balance the demands of religious and secular authorities while maintaining the internal harmony of their communities. The most successful among them became skilled political operators who could navigate complex negotiations while protecting the interests of the women under their care. But the personal dimension remained the most important and the most challenging. Individual relationships had to be maintained and nurtured within systems designed to prevent exactly those connections. This required creativity, courage, and an almost artistic sensitivity to the subtle communications that could express love without revealing it to hostile observers. Catherine and Helene's enforced separation had taught them lessons about maintaining connection across institutional barriers that proved valuable not just for their own relationship, but for the broader community of women facing similar challenges. They developed techniques for communication that operated through multiple intermediaries, creating chains of discrete contacts that could convey complex messages while protecting each link from the possibility of exposure. The system they created was elegant in its simplicity and powerful in its effectiveness. A particular arrangement of flowers in the chapel might indicate that a message was waiting in a specific location. The selection of readings during communal prayer could convey information about times and places for discrete meetings. Even the way sisters arranged their eating utensils during meals became part of an elaborate code that allowed complex conversations to take place in full view of supervisory authorities. These communication systems were not unique to their convent. Similar networks were developing in religious communities across Europe, each adapted to local conditions, but sharing common principles that made them mutually compatible. A sister travelling between institutions could quickly learn to recognise the local variations of codes that operated according to universal patterns. The sophistication of these systems reflected the high level of education and intellectual sophistication possessed by many religious women. Far from being ignorant peasants seeking refuge from secular hardships, many nuns were highly educated members of noble families who brought considerable intellectual resources to their religious communities. Their ability to create and maintain complex systems of coded communication reflected skills that would have impressed secular authorities if they had been aware of their existence. The artistic expressions of these relationships became increasingly sophisticated as well. The illuminated manuscripts produced in convent scriptoriums began to incorporate subtle visual elements that carried personal meaning for their creators while remaining invisible to casual observers. Particular colour combinations, specific arrangements of decorative elements, even the selection of texts to be illustrated could convey messages between artists and their intended audiences. Music provided another vehicle for coded communication. The complex polyphonic compositions that emerged from religious communities during this period often incorporated harmonic structures that created opportunities for individual voices to communicate across the formal boundaries of liturgical performance. A particular melodic line might be designed to showcase a specific singer's voice, creating moments of musical intimacy within communal worship. The medical knowledge possessed by many religious women also became a tool for maintaining relationships that might otherwise have been impossible to sustain. Understanding of herbal remedies, dietary supplements, and physical treatments allowed healers like Sister Judith to address the health problems that could result from emotional stress and physical isolation. These treatments were never recorded in official medical documents, but they were passed between women through informal networks that operated parallel to the formal structures of religious authority. Knowledge about contraceptive herbs, treatments for depression, and techniques for managing the physical symptoms of celibacy became part of a hidden curriculum that prepared women for the realities of religious life that official training programs preferred to ignore. The preservation of this knowledge required careful attention to security and succession planning. Older sisters had to identify younger women who could be trusted with dangerous information, training them gradually in techniques that could not be safely documented in written form. The process of knowledge transfer became itself a form of intimate relationship that created bonds between teachers and students that transcended the formal boundaries of religious hierarchy. The psychological sophistication of these communities was equally impressive. Women who had been forced into religious life against their will, or who discovered that their emotional and physical needs could not be satisfied within official institutional frameworks, developed remarkably effective strategies for maintaining mental health and emotional stability under conditions that might otherwise have led to serious psychological damage. These strategies included techniques for managing isolation, methods for maintaining hope during periods of enforced separation from loved ones, and systems for providing mutual support that operated beneath the threshold of official detection. The informal counselling networks that developed within religious communities often proved more effective than the formal spiritual direction provided by male clergy who lacked understanding of the specific challenges faced by women in religious life. The communities that emerged from this period of adaptation and innovation were fundamentally different from their predecessors. They had learned to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, maintaining official compliance with church regulations while creating underground spaces where human needs could be acknowledged and addressed. This dual existence required constant vigilance and sophisticated coordination, but it also created opportunities for forms of intimacy and creativity that might not have been possible under more permissive but less challenging circumstances. The women who mastered these systems developed skills that extended far beyond the management of personal relationships. They became expert at reading political situations, at managing complex information networks, at maintaining organisational discipline under pressure. These skills often proved valuable in other contexts, enabling religious women to play important roles in broader political and economic developments that shaped medieval European society. The legacy of this period of innovation and resistance extended far beyond the immediate communities that created these systems. The techniques developed for maintaining forbidden relationships were adapted for other purposes, including the protection of intellectual and artistic innovations that challenged official church doctrine. The networks created to support emotional relationships became vehicles for spreading new ideas about theology, politics, and social organisation. The theological innovations developed to justify same-sex relationships contributed to broader developments in mystical thought that influenced religious practice throughout Europe. The economic strategies developed to maintain institutional independence provided models that were adopted by other marginalised communities seeking to protect themselves from hostile authorities. The political techniques developed to manage relationships with secular and religious authorities became part of a broader toolkit for institutional survival that proved valuable in many different contexts. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological and social innovations developed during this period provided models for creating supportive communities within hostile institutional environments. The techniques for maintaining hope, for preserving identity, for creating meaning under oppressive conditions became part of a broader tradition of resistance that influenced many subsequent social movements. The secret sex lives of medieval nuns were thus about much more than individual relationships or personal desires. They were part of a broader struggle for human dignity and agency that challenged fundamental assumptions about power, authority, and the proper ordering of society. The women who participated in these relationships were not simply satisfying personal needs. They were creating alternative models of human community that offered different visions of what religious life could become. Their success in creating and maintaining these alternative communities despite enormous risks and institutional opposition demonstrates the power of human creativity and determination when confronted with seemingly impossible challenges. Their stories remind us that even the most oppressive systems cannot completely eliminate the human capacity for love, creativity, and resistance. But their stories also remind us of the costs associated with such resistance. The constant vigilance required to maintain forbidden relationships took an enormous psychological toll on the women involved. The fear of discovery created chronic stress that affected every aspect of daily life. The need for secrecy often prevented relationships from developing their full potential, forcing lovers to settle for fragments of intimacy when they might have preferred complete emotional and physical union. The institutional costs were equally significant. Communities that devoted substantial energy to maintaining underground networks of forbidden relationships had less time and attention available for other activities that might have contributed to their spiritual, intellectual, or economic development. The atmosphere of secrecy and suspicion that accompanied these activities often undermined the trust and cooperation that religious communities needed to function effectively. These costs were not distributed equally throughout religious communities. Women who chose to participate in forbidden relationships bore greater risks than those who conformed to official expectations. Those who possessed valuable skills or important family connections often received greater protection than those who lacked such advantages. The systems developed to protect forbidden relationships sometimes created their own forms of inequality and exploitation that replicated rather than challenged broader patterns of social injustice. Yet despite these costs and limitations, the women who created and maintained these underground networks achieved something remarkable. They proved that human love and creativity could survive and even flourish under conditions designed to eliminate them. They demonstrated that institutional authority, no matter how comprehensive or determined, could not completely control the most intimate aspects of human experience. Their legacy extends far beyond the specific historical context in which they lived. Their techniques for creating supportive communities within hostile environments, their methods for maintaining hope and identity under oppressive conditions, their strategies for preserving and transmitting dangerous knowledge all became part of a broader tradition of resistance that has influenced many subsequent struggles for human dignity and freedom. The secret sex lives of medieval nuns thus represent more than an interesting footnote to religious history. They provide insights into fundamental questions about human nature, institutional power, and the conditions necessary for authentic community and meaningful relationship. They remind us that the struggle between official authority and human authenticity is not confined to any particular historical period, but represents an ongoing challenge that each generation must face in its own way. As we continue to explore their world, we will discover that their innovations and adaptations had consequences that extended far beyond the walls of their own communities. The networks they created, the techniques they developed, and the courage they demonstrated would inspire and enable other forms of resistance that would ultimately transform not just religious life, but the broader social and political landscape of medieval Europe. The investigation that was meant to eliminate their influence had instead taught them lessons about survival and resistance that would make their networks more sophisticated, more durable, and ultimately more threatening to the institutional authority that sought to control them. The secret was no longer just about individual relationships. It had become about entire communities learning to live double lives, maintaining official compliance, while nurturing underground worlds where human authenticity could flourish despite every effort to suppress it. The transformation of the convent of St. Clare into a carefully orchestrated theatre of resistance was perhaps most evident in the daily routines that had once seemed so ordinary. The morning prayers that had traditionally been times of simple devotion became elaborate performances where every gesture carried multiple meanings, where the positioning of hands during recitation could signal availability for discreet conversation, where the selection of particular responses revealed emotional states that could not be safely expressed in words. Sister Bernadette, who had served as cantor for nearly 8 years, discovered that her role as leader of communal worship provided unprecedented opportunities for orchestrating these coded communications. The hymns she selected, the pace at which she led the chanting, even the moments when she chose to pause for reflection, all became elements in a complex system that allowed the entire community to communicate without speaking. Her innovations went far beyond simple message passing. She developed techniques for using musical performance to create what could only be described as collective emotional experiences that satisfied the deep human need for connection while remaining completely invisible to outside observers. During particularly beautiful passages of liturgical music, when voices blended in perfect harmony and individual identities dissolved into something larger than themselves, the sisters, experienced moments of spiritual and emotional union that transcended the physical separations imposed by institutional authority. These musical innovations spread to other communities through the networks of travelling clergy and visiting officials who carried reports of the remarkable liturgical performances they had witnessed. Within months, convents across France were experimenting with similar techniques, adapting Bernadette's methods to their own local conditions and musical traditions. The economic implications of these developments were equally significant. The reputation of the convent of St. Clare for exceptional liturgical music began to attract wealthy patrons who were willing to provide substantial donations in exchange for the privilege of attending special services. This increased income provided the community with greater financial independence, which in turn created more opportunities for the kind of institutional autonomy that made underground activities possible. Mother Superior Clotilde, who had initially been sceptical of Bernadette's musical innovations, gradually came to understand their strategic value. The attention focused on the convent's artistic achievements deflected scrutiny from other activities that might have attracted unwanted attention. Church officials who came to investigate reports of exceptional musical performances rarely looked beyond the obvious explanations for the community's reputation. The success of this strategy encouraged similar innovations in other areas of convent life. The herb garden, which had always been a practical necessity for providing medicinal plants, was expanded and reorganized to create what amounted to a living library of botanical knowledge that included plants whose properties extended far beyond simple healing. Sister Judith, whose medical expertise had made her invaluable during the period of increased surveillance, began cultivating species that had been mentioned in ancient texts, but were rarely grown in religious communities. Her justification for these additions was always framed in terms of their potential medical applications, but her real purpose was to create resources that could address the full range of human needs that arose within a community of women living in enforced isolation. The knowledge required to cultivate and utilize these plants had to be acquired through careful study of sources that were not readily available in most religious libraries. This necessitated the development of relationships with scholars, physicians, and herbalists outside the religious world, connections that created opportunities for gathering intelligence about political and social developments that might affect the community's safety. These external relationships were carefully managed to avoid creating suspicions about the true nature of the convent's interests. Sister Judith presented herself as a dedicated religious healer, seeking to expand her knowledge for the benefit of her community and the local population. Her reputation for discretion and effectiveness made her a valued contact for secular medical practitioners who appreciated having access to someone who could treat female patients with sensitivity and understanding. The information networks that developed around these medical relationships proved invaluable for gathering early warning about potential investigations or policy changes that might threaten the community. Physicians who served wealthy families often learned about political developments before they became public knowledge. Merchants who supplied medicinal plants travelled widely and could provide reports about conditions in distant regions. The integration of this intelligence into the community's decision-making processes required the development of sophisticated systems for evaluating and responding to potential threats. Mother Superior Clotilde established what amounted to an informal council of senior sisters who met regularly to assess political developments and coordinate protective measures when necessary. These meetings were carefully disguised as routine administrative discussions about practical matters like budget planning, work assignments, and maintenance schedules. The real agenda was never documented in official records, but the decisions made during these sessions shaped every aspect of the community's operations. The level of organizational sophistication required to maintain these multiple layers of activity while preserving the appearance of simple religious devotion was extraordinary. Every sister had to understand not just her official role within the community, but also her function within the various underground networks that provided protection and support for activities that could not be officially acknowledged. This dual existence required remarkable psychological flexibility and emotional discipline. Sisters had to be able to shift seamlessly between their public personas and their private identities, maintaining perfect performance in their official roles, while simultaneously participating in activities that would have resulted in severe punishment if discovered. The training required to develop these capabilities was itself a carefully concealed process. New arrivals at the convent underwent what appeared to be standard religious instruction, but embedded within this formal education was a subtle curriculum that prepared them for the realities of life within a community that operated according to rules that were never explicitly stated. The most challenging aspect of this training was teaching young women to recognize and interpret the various forms of coded communication that permeated daily life without making the codes themselves explicit. This required the development of intuitive understanding rather than intellectual knowledge, a process that could take months or even years to complete. Not every sister proved capable of mastering these skills. Some lacked the psychological flexibility required to maintain dual identities. Others were unable to develop the sensitivity necessary to recognize subtle forms of communication. A few proved unable to maintain the discretion that the system required for its survival. These failures created their own challenges for the community. Sisters who could not be trusted with complete knowledge about underground activities had to be managed carefully to prevent them from inadvertently revealing information that could compromise the entire system. This often meant excluding them from certain activities or relationships, creating a secondary form of isolation within what was already an isolated community. The emotional costs of these exclusions were significant. Women who had joined religious communities seeking spiritual fellowship and mutual support often found themselves relegated to the margins of community life, aware that important activities were taking place around them but unable to participate fully. This created resentment and loneliness that could lead to other forms of disruptive behaviour. Managing these internal tensions required considerable skill and sensitivity from community leaders. They had to balance the need for security against the human costs of exclusion, finding ways to provide meaningful roles for sisters who could not be fully trusted while protecting the activities that made life bearable for those who were more deeply involved in underground networks. The solutions that emerged were often creative and surprisingly effective. Sisters who could not be trusted with knowledge about forbidden relationships might be given important responsibilities in areas like external relations or economic management, where their lack of involvement in underground activities actually enhanced their credibility with outside authorities. These arrangements created a complex social hierarchy within the community that operated according to principles that were never officially acknowledged. Sisters understood their positions within this unofficial structure through subtle indicators that were as meaningful as any formal organizational chart. The sophistication of this system reflected the high level of intelligence and organizational ability possessed by many religious women. Despite being denied access to formal education in management or politics, they had developed techniques for coordinating complex activities that would have impressed secular administrators if they had been aware of their existence. The success of these innovations began to attract attention from other religious communities facing similar challenges. The methods developed at the convent of St. Clare were adapted and refined by women in monasteries, beguinages, and other religious institutions across Europe. What had begun as a response to local pressures gradually became part of a broader movement that transformed the nature of religious life for women throughout the medieval world. This transformation was not limited to Catholic institutions. Similar innovations appeared in communities associated with various reform movements, mystical groups, and even heretical sects that operated on the margins of official religious authority. The techniques for maintaining forbidden relationships proved adaptable to many different contexts where human needs conflicted with institutional requirements. The theological implications of these developments were profound. The success of underground networks in maintaining spiritual communities that honored both divine calling and human needs challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between religious authority and authentic spiritual experience. Women who had been told that obedience to institutional rules was necessary for salvation were discovering that disobedience to those same rules often led to deeper spiritual fulfillment and more authentic religious community. These discoveries led to the development of alternative theological frameworks that provided religious justification for resistance to institutional authority when that authority conflicted with genuine spiritual needs. Drawing on mystical traditions, biblical scholarship, and their own lived experiences, women created sophisticated arguments for forms of religious life that had never been officially sanctioned but proved more spiritually satisfying than approved alternatives. The preservation and transmission of these theological innovations required the same kind of careful concealment that protected other underground activities. Dangerous ideas had to be disguised as orthodox teaching, embedded within approved texts, or transmitted through oral traditions that left no documentary evidence for hostile authorities to discover. The women who engaged in this theological work were often highly educated and intellectually sophisticated. Many had received training in Latin, philosophy, and biblical interpretation that enabled them to engage with religious texts at levels that would have surprised male clergy, who assumed that women lacked the intellectual capacity for serious theological work. Their innovations often proved more psychologically satisfying and spiritually meaningful than the official theology they were meant to replace. By grounding religious teaching in lived experience, rather than abstract principle, they created forms of spiritual understanding that spoke directly to the real challenges faced by women attempting to live authentic religious lives within oppressive institutional frameworks. The influence of these theological innovations extended far beyond the religious communities where they originated. Ideas developed by cloistered nuns found their way into broader intellectual and cultural movements that shaped medieval European society. The mystical traditions that provided cover for forbidden relationships also influenced developments in philosophy, literature, and political thought that had consequences extending far beyond religious life. The artistic expressions that emerged from these communities reflected their complex relationship with official religious culture. The illuminated manuscripts, musical compositions, and other creative works produced by nuns often incorporated subtle elements that challenged orthodox teaching while maintaining the appearance of perfect conformity. These artistic innovations required remarkable creativity and technical skill. Artists had to master traditional forms well enough to satisfy conservative critics, while embedding within their work elements that conveyed alternative meanings to audiences capable of recognizing them. The resulting works often achieved levels of beauty and sophistication that exceeded anything produced by artists working within more conventional frameworks. The preservation of these artistic achievements required the same careful planning that protected other dangerous activities. Works that contained potentially controversial elements had to be hidden, disguised, or protected through networks of sympathetic collectors who understood their true significance. Many of these works have been lost over the centuries, destroyed by authorities who recognized their subversive potential or simply neglected by later generations who lacked the knowledge necessary to interpret their hidden meanings. The few examples that survive provide tantalizing glimpses of a rich artistic tradition that operated parallel to but largely separate from the official, cultural productions of medieval religious institutions. The political implications of these developments were equally significant. Religious communities that had learned to operate sophisticated underground networks possessed organizational capabilities that could be adapted to other purposes when circumstances required. The skills developed for maintaining forbidden relationships proved useful for coordinating resistance to secular authorities, managing economic relationships that operated outside official oversight, and preserving dangerous knowledge during periods of political instability. These capabilities made religious women valuable allies for various political movements that sought to challenge established authority. Their networks could provide secure communication channels, safe houses for fugitives, and coordination mechanisms for activities that required careful concealment from hostile authorities. The involvement of religious women in broader political activities was always carefully concealed, but evidence suggests that their contributions were often crucial to the success of movements that might otherwise have failed due to inadequate organization or insufficient security. Their experience in maintaining dual identities and operating multiple networks simultaneously provided skills that were invaluable in political contexts where discovery could result in execution rather than merely ecclesiastical punishment. The economic resources controlled by many religious communities also made them important players in broader political and economic developments. Convents that had achieved financial independence through careful investment and business management could provide funding for political activities while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. These financial contributions were often channeled through complex networks of intermediaries that made it virtually impossible to trace the ultimate source of funding for particular activities. The same techniques that had been developed to conceal forbidden relationships proved equally effective for hiding financial relationships that might have been considered treasonous if discovered. The sophistication of these economic networks reflected the high level of business acumen possessed by many religious women. Despite being excluded from formal commercial education, they had developed through practical experience and careful observation the skills necessary to manage complex financial operations that often proved more successful than comparable enterprises managed by male counterparts. The success of these various innovations gradually transformed the nature of religious life for women throughout medieval Europe. What had begun as isolated responses to local pressures evolved into a comprehensive alternative model of religious community that honoured both spiritual calling and human needs. This alternative model proved remarkably durable and adaptable. The techniques developed during the medieval period continued to influence religious communities for centuries, providing tools for maintaining authentic spiritual life, even under conditions of severe institutional oppression. The legacy of these innovations extends far beyond their immediate historical context. The organizational techniques, theological insights, and creative strategies developed by medieval religious women have influenced many subsequent movements seeking to create authentic community within hostile institutional environments. Their example demonstrates that even the most comprehensive systems of control cannot completely eliminate human creativity and resistance. When institutional authority conflicts with genuine human needs, people will find ways to create alternative systems that honour both their practical requirements and their deepest values. The secret sex lives of medieval nuns thus represent more than an interesting historical curiosity. They provide insights into fundamental questions about the relationship between authority and authenticity, between institutional requirements and human needs, between official doctrine and lived experience. Their stories remind us that the struggle to create authentic community and meaningful relationship is not confined to any particular historical period, but represents an ongoing challenge that each generation must face using the tools and opportunities available to them. The courage, creativity, and determination they demonstrated in the face of seemingly impossible odds continue to inspire and guide those who seek to live authentically within systems designed to prevent exactly that kind of authentic existence. But their story was far from over. The networks they had created, the techniques they had developed, and the courage they had demonstrated would soon face their greatest test. Political changes, sweeping across Europe, would challenge every assumption about religious life, creating both unprecedented opportunities and mortal dangers for communities that had learned to live in the shadows between official approval and underground resistance. The world was changing in ways that would transform not just religious institutions, but the entire social fabric of medieval society. And the women who had mastered the arts of concealment and resistance would soon discover whether their hard-won skills could protect them through upheavals that would reshape the landscape of faith, politics, and human relationship throughout the known world. The changes came like winter wind through stone corridors, cold and inexorable. By the early 1300s, the political landscape that had sheltered communities like the convent of St. Clare began to shift in ways that would test every survival strategy these women had so carefully constructed. The Great Famine was spreading across Europe, bringing with it not just hunger, but a desperate search for scapegoats. And when people grow desperate, they often turn their suspicions toward those who live differently, who possess knowledge others don't understand, who seem to thrive while others suffer. Sister Catherine, now in her 4th year of enforced separation from Helene, had become something she never expected to be. A keeper of secrets so dangerous that their discovery could destroy not just individuals, but entire networks spanning half of France. The infirmary had evolved into what amounted to an intelligence hub, where information flowed in through the confessions of the sick and flowed out through carefully coded messages hidden in requests for medical supplies. The scope of what she had learned would have terrified her younger self. The underground networks connecting religious communities weren't just about protecting forbidden relationships. They were preserving knowledge that the Church had declared heretical, harbouring refugees from political persecution, and maintaining economic relationships that operated entirely outside official oversight. The women she had once thought of as simple nuns, living quiet lives of prayer, were actually part of a vast underground resistance movement that challenged the very foundations of medieval authority. The realization had come gradually, through fragments of information that slowly assembled into a comprehensive picture, a whispered reference to manuscripts hidden in other convents, a request for specific herbs that had no legitimate medical application, a coded message passed through a dying woman who had travelled from a community 300 miles away. Each piece had seemed insignificant by itself, but together they revealed the existence of something far larger and more dangerous than anything Catherine had imagined possible. The theological innovations alone were revolutionary enough to warrant investigation by the Inquisition if they were ever discovered. Sister Perpetua's hidden writings, which Catherine had once thought remarkable for their sophisticated arguments about divine love, were actually part of a comprehensive alternative theology that rejected fundamental assumptions about religious authority, sexual morality, and the proper relationship between human and divine will. These ideas weren't confined to their own community. Similar theological developments were taking place in convents across Europe, with innovations in one location being refined and expanded in others through networks of communication that operated with remarkable efficiency despite the primitive transportation and communication technologies of the medieval world. The result was an evolving body of religious thought that provided comprehensive justification for forms of spiritual life that official church doctrine condemned as heretical. The practical implications were equally revolutionary. Communities that had mastered these alternative theological frameworks were operating according to principles that turned traditional religious hierarchy upside down. Decisions were made through consensus rather than autocratic authority, resources were shared according to need rather than status. Relationships were based on affection and compatibility rather than institutional assignment. The economic dimensions were perhaps most threatening to established authority. The financial networks connecting these communities had evolved into what amounted to an alternative banking system that operated entirely outside official oversight. Money, goods, and services flowed between institutions according to principles that ignored political boundaries and religious hierarchies. Some convents had become remarkably wealthy through careful investment and business management, but their wealth was deployed not for personal luxury, but for collective security and mutual support. They purchased properties that could serve as safe houses for refugees. They funded scholars whose research challenged official doctrine. They maintained private armies of loyal servants who could provide protection when conventional legal remedies proved inadequate. The political implications were staggering. These religious communities possessed organizational capabilities, financial resources, and intelligence networks that rivaled those of secular governments. Their loyalty was not to kings or bishops, but to each other and to principles that often conflicted with the interests of established authority. Catherine understood that she was witnessing the emergence of what amounted to a shadow society that operated parallel to, but largely independent, from the official structures of medieval civilization. The women who participated in this society maintained the appearance of submission to religious and secular authority while actually owing their primary allegiance to alternative institutions that honoured different values and operated according to different principles. The sophistication required to maintain this dual existence was extraordinary. Every sister had to master multiple identities, shifting seamlessly between public compliance and private resistance, depending on the immediate circumstances. They had to understand not just their official roles within religious hierarchy, but also their functions within various underground networks that operated according to entirely different organizational principles. The psychological demands were enormous, living with constant awareness that discovery could result in torture, execution, or the destruction of entire communities created levels of stress that few people could sustain over extended periods. Yet these women had developed techniques for managing this stress that allowed them not just to survive, but to thrive under conditions that would have broken most people. The training required to develop these capabilities had evolved into a sophisticated educational system that operated entirely outside official oversight. New arrivals at participating communities underwent what appeared to be standard religious instruction, but embedded within this formal education was a comprehensive curriculum that prepared them for life within a parallel society governed by radically different principles. The most remarkable aspect of this education was its emphasis on developing intuitive understanding rather than explicit knowledge. Students learned to recognize and interpret complex systems of coded communication without ever being taught the codes themselves. They developed sensitivity to subtle forms of social organization without ever having the organizational principles explained to them directly. This indirect approach to education served multiple security functions. Students who failed to develop the necessary sensitivities simply remained at the level of surface understanding, never realizing that deeper layers of meaning existed. Those who proved incapable of maintaining necessary discretion could be excluded from sensitive activities without ever learning enough to compromise the entire system if they were captured and interrogated. But the most important function of this educational approach was that it created forms of understanding that were almost impossible to communicate to hostile authorities even under torture. Knowledge that existed at the level of intuitive understanding rather than explicit instruction could not be extracted through conventional interrogation techniques. The networks that emerged from these educational innovations were remarkably resilient and adaptable. They could survive the loss of key individuals, adapt to changing political circumstances, and maintain their essential functions even under direct attack. The redundancy built into these systems meant that no single failure could compromise the entire network. Catherine had learned to appreciate this resilience through direct experience. The investigation that had destroyed her relationship with Helene had actually strengthened the underground networks by forcing them to develop more sophisticated protection mechanisms. What had seemed like a devastating attack had ultimately made the community more secure and more capable of protecting its members. But she also understood that the success of these networks created new vulnerabilities. The very sophistication that made them effective also made them threatening to established authority. As their capabilities became more obvious to outside observers, they attracted attention from enemies who possessed resources and determination that exceeded anything they had previously faced. The political changes sweeping across Europe were creating conditions that would test these networks in ways they had never been tested before. The consolidation of royal power in France was reducing the autonomy that had previously protected religious communities from direct interference. The growing influence of the Inquisition was creating new forms of investigation that were specifically designed to uncover the kinds of hidden activities that these networks specialized in concealing. Most ominously, economic pressures were forcing secular authorities to look more closely at the financial resources controlled by religious institutions. The wealth that had previously provided protection through its discretion was becoming a target for confiscation that could destroy the economic foundations of the entire system. Sister Helene, working in the kitchen, had become acutely aware of these external pressures through her contacts with merchants, delivery workers, and travelling officials who brought news from the outside world. The reports she gathered painted a picture of increasing hostility toward religious institutions that operated with too much independence from secular and ecclesiastical oversight. The techniques that had previously provided protection were becoming less effective as authorities developed more sophisticated methods for detecting underground activities. The coded communications that had once seemed unbreakable were being deciphered by investigators who had learned to recognize the patterns that revealed hidden meanings. The financial networks that had operated in secrecy were being exposed through new accounting methods that traced money flows with unprecedented precision. The theological innovations that had provided intellectual justification for resistance were being countered by new forms of orthodox doctrine specifically designed to eliminate the ambiguities that had previously created space for alternative interpretations. The Church was becoming more systematic in its efforts to identify and suppress forms of religious thought that challenged official authority. Even the artistic expressions that had carried hidden meanings were coming under scrutiny from authorities who had learned to recognize the visual and musical codes that conveyed dangerous ideas. The beautiful manuscripts, musical compositions, and other creative works that had provided both aesthetic pleasure and political protection were being examined with suspicious eyes that sought to uncover subversive content. The women who had created and maintained these networks faced an impossible choice. They could abandon the systems that had sustained them for decades, accepting the spiritual and emotional impoverishment that would result from complete submission to official authority, or they could continue their resistance, knowing that discovery now carried consequences that extended far beyond individual punishment to the destruction of entire communities and ways of life. Most chose to continue, but with the understanding that they were entering a new phase of struggle that would require even greater courage, creativity, and determination than anything they had previously faced. The stakes had been raised to levels that made every decision a matter of life and death, not just for individuals, but for the survival of alternative forms of spiritual and social organization that had taken centuries to develop. The innovations that emerged from this period of crisis were remarkable for their boldness and sophistication. Rather than simply trying to hide more effectively, many communities chose to become more aggressive in their resistance, developing offensive capabilities that allowed them to strike back at their persecutors rather than simply trying to avoid detection. These new strategies included techniques for gathering intelligence about planned investigations, methods for sabotaging hostile operations, and systems for coordinating defensive measures across multiple communities simultaneously. The women who had once been content to protect their own relationships and communities began to see themselves as part of a broader struggle that required active engagement with the forces arrayed against them. The transformation was profound. What had begun as defensive measures to protect forbidden relationships had evolved into a comprehensive resistance movement that challenged the fundamental structures of medieval authority. The secret sex lives of medieval nuns had become the foundation for something far larger and more threatening to established order than anyone had ever imagined possible, but this evolution came at enormous cost. The escalation of resistance inevitably led to escalation of repression, as authorities recognized the true scope and sophistication of the networks they faced. They responded with increasing violence and determination. The relatively gentle punishments that had characterized earlier periods gave way to interrogations, executions, and the systematic destruction of communities that had existed for centuries. The women who had chosen resistance understood these costs and accepted them as the price of maintaining their humanity in the face of systems designed to deny that humanity. They had learned through bitter experience that submission to unjust authority led not to safety, but to a different form of destruction, one that killed the spirit while leaving the body technically alive. Their choice to resist, despite the enormous risks involved, represented a fundamental affirmation of human dignity and the right to live authentically, even under the most oppressive circumstances. They had decided that some things were worth dying for, and that love, creativity, and spiritual truth were among those things. The legacy of their courage would extend far beyond their own historical moment. The techniques they developed, the principles they articulated, and the example they set would inspire countless others facing similar choices between submission and resistance, between safety and authenticity, between survival and meaningful life. But in the immediate term, they faced the most dangerous period in their long history of hidden resistance. The forces arrayed against them were more powerful and more determined than ever before. The protection mechanisms they had relied upon were failing under the pressure of systematic investigation and repression. Yet they persisted, driven by love that had proven stronger than fear, by hope that had survived decades of oppression, by faith in possibilities that extended beyond the brutal realities of their immediate circumstances. They had learned that the human spirit, when properly nourished and courageously expressed, could transcend even the most comprehensive efforts to contain and control it. The secret sex lives of medieval nuns were entering their final and most critical phase, where everything they had built over generations would be tested against forces that sought not just to control them, but to eliminate them entirely. The outcome of this struggle would determine not just their own fate, but the possibilities for human freedom and authentic community for generations to come. The story was approaching its climax, but the resolution remained uncertain. Would love prove stronger than hate? Would creativity triumph over repression? Would the networks they had built with such care and courage survive the storms that threatened to destroy everything they had created? The answers would be written in blood and courage, in sacrifice and determination, in the final confrontation between human authenticity and institutional power that would define the future of religious life and human community throughout the medieval world. The winter of 1347 brought more than cold to the convent of St. Clare. It brought the whispers that every underground network dreaded most. The kind that spoke of ships arriving from distant ports carrying more than silk and spices. The plague had come to Europe, and with it, a terror that would reshape every calculation these women had made about survival, resistance, and the price of love. Sister Catherine, now in her 8th year of separation from Helene, felt the change before anyone spoke it aloud. The rhythm of the infirmary shifted as local villagers began arriving with symptoms that didn't match anything in her carefully accumulated medical knowledge. The fevered confessions she heard took on a new urgency, as if people sensed they might be speaking their final truths to another human being. But it wasn't just the disease that terrified her, it was the way people responded to it. When death stalks the land with such visible hunger, communities turn inward. Suspicion replaces trust, and anyone who seems different becomes a potential cause of divine wrath. The elaborate networks of protection and communication that had taken decades to build could crumble in weeks if fear replaced the careful calculations that had kept them hidden. The first sign of real danger came through Sister Helene's kitchen networks. A merchant who had been carrying coded messages between convents for over 5 years arrived with news that settlements throughout the region were beginning to blame religious communities for the plague's spread. Stories circulated about nuns who practiced dark arts, who had brought divine punishment upon the land through their unnatural behaviours and forbidden knowledge. The accusations were as predictable as they were deadly. Communities that had operated too independently, that had possessed too much wealth or knowledge, that had seemed too content with their isolated lives, were being targeted by mobs seeking someone to blame for the catastrophe that was consuming everything they knew. Mother Superior Clotilde understood immediately that their long period of successful concealment was ending. The very sophistication that had protected them was now making them visible to people desperate for explanations that made sense of senseless suffering. Their medical knowledge, their financial resources, their networks of communication, all the things that had enabled their survival were now marking them as threats to be eliminated. The decision she faced was perhaps the most difficult any leader could confront. She could attempt to maintain the networks that had sustained the community for so long, knowing that discovery now meant not just punishment but annihilation, or she could dismantle everything they had built, destroying decades of work in hopes of becoming invisible enough to survive the storm that was approaching. She chose a third path, one that required a kind of courage that few people possess. Rather than simply hiding or surrendering, she decided to accelerate the timeline for everything they had been planning to do eventually. If the networks were going to be discovered anyway, they would use them to accomplish as much as possible before the end came. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity so intense it seemed to compress years of careful work into a frantic race against time. Documents that had been hidden for decades were copied and distributed to distant communities before the originals were destroyed. Financial resources that had been carefully hoarded were deployed to purchase properties, fund escapes, and establish safe houses in regions that might escape the worst of the persecution. Most importantly, the knowledge that had been preserved in human memory was transmitted with desperate urgency to women who might survive to carry it forward. The theological innovations, the medical techniques, the organizational methods, the artistic traditions, everything that had made their alternative communities possible was condensed into forms that could be remembered and recreated when the current crisis passed. Sister Catherine found herself at the centre of this frantic preservation effort. Her years in the infirmary had given her access to more dangerous knowledge than almost anyone else in the community. She knew the locations of hidden manuscripts in dozens of convents, the identities of key figures in resistance networks throughout France, the financial arrangements that had enabled communities to maintain their independence. All of this had to be recorded, encoded, and distributed before it was lost forever. But the very act of doing so created enormous risks. Every document they created was potential evidence that could condemn not just them, but everyone connected to their networks. Every person they trusted with dangerous information became a vulnerability that could destroy the entire system if they were captured and interrogated. The psychological pressure was unlike anything they had previously experienced. The careful balance between concealment and communication that had characterized their previous work was replaced by a desperate urgency that made every decision feel like a gamble with lives that extended far beyond their own community. Yet even under these impossible circumstances, love found ways to assert itself. Catherine and Helene, separated for so long by institutional decree, began to communicate with a directness that would have been unthinkable during periods of lesser crisis. The elaborate codes that had protected their relationship were abandoned in favour of simple honesty about feelings that could no longer be safely hidden behind theological metaphors. Their correspondence during this period, hidden in medical supply requests and kitchen inventory lists, reveals a depth of emotion that had survived years of enforced separation and institutional pressure. They wrote about dreams they had shared across the distance imposed between them, about plans they had made for a future that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive, about the profound gratitude they felt for having found each other, despite all the forces arrayed against such connection. But they also wrote about practical matters with a clarity that demonstrated how completely they understood the gravity of their situation. They discussed escape routes that might allow them to survive if the convent was attacked. They identified potential allies who might provide shelter if they were forced to flee. They even planned for the possibility that one might survive while the other did not, making arrangements for continuing their work even if they could no longer continue their relationship. These conversations were taking place throughout the underground networks as couples and communities faced the possibility that everything they had built together might be destroyed by forces entirely beyond their control. The plague wasn't just killing bodies, it was killing the social arrangements that had made hidden relationships possible. Yet remarkably, the crisis also created opportunities that had never existed before. As conventional authority structures collapsed under the pressure of mass death and social disruption, space opened for alternative forms of organisation that might have been impossible under normal circumstances. Some religious communities abandoned all pretense of conformity to official expectations, openly declaring their independence from ecclesiastical authority that had proven incapable of protecting them from either disease or persecution. They established their own governance systems, their own theological frameworks, their own economic arrangements that operated entirely outside traditional religious hierarchy. These experiments in radical autonomy were necessarily short-lived, but they provided valuable insights into possibilities that had previously existed only in theoretical discussions. For the first time, women who had spent their entire lives navigating the constraints imposed by male religious authority were able to experience what it might feel like to live according to principles they had developed themselves. The artistic and intellectual achievements that emerged from this brief period of radical freedom were extraordinary. Released from the need to disguise their innovations within acceptable forms, women created works that expressed their authentic spiritual and emotional experiences with unprecedented directness and power. Music that had previously hidden its meanings within conventional liturgical structures became boldly experimental, incorporating harmonies and rhythms that reflected the actual emotional lives of their creators, rather than the sanitized spiritual experiences that official religious culture preferred to acknowledge. Visual art abandoned the careful symbolism that had been necessary for concealment, depicting relationships and experiences that had never been officially acknowledged, but had always been central to the actual spiritual lives of religious women. Most remarkably, Theological writing during this period achieved levels of sophistication and originality that rivaled anything being produced in official academic institutions. Women who had been denied access to formal theological education demonstrated intellectual capabilities that challenged every assumption about the relationship between gender and scholarly achievement. These innovations were preserved through the same networks that were being used to distribute practical survival information. Communities that possessed the resources and security to maintain libraries became repositories for knowledge that might otherwise have been lost when its creators were killed or dispersed. The preservation efforts required unprecedented cooperation between communities that had previously maintained only limited contact with each other. Geographic barriers, linguistic differences, and theological disagreements were set aside in favour of collective recognition that the survival of any alternative to official religious culture depended on sharing resources and knowledge as widely as possible. The scope of this cooperation revealed for the first time the true extent of the networks that had developed over the previous centuries. What had appeared to be isolated experiments in religious innovation were actually part of a comprehensive alternative culture that extended across national boundaries and included thousands of women who had been working towards similar goals through different methods. The realization that they were part of something so much larger than their individual communities provided enormous psychological comfort during a period when everything else seemed to be disintegrating. Even if their own institutions were destroyed, the ideas and practices they had developed would survive in other locations and could eventually be revived when circumstances permitted. But this larger perspective also made clear the enormous scope of what was being threatened by the current crisis. The alternative religious culture that was being destroyed represented centuries of accumulated wisdom, creativity, and human achievement that could not be easily replaced if it was lost. The urgency of preservation efforts intensified as reports arrived of communities that had already been destroyed by plague, persecution, or simple abandonment as their members fled to seek safety elsewhere. Each loss represented not just human tragedy, but the destruction of irreplaceable knowledge and experience that had taken generations to develop. The psychological toll of witnessing this destruction was enormous. Women who had devoted their entire lives to building alternative forms of spiritual community were forced to watch as everything they had created was systematically eliminated by forces that seemed to represent the worst aspects of human nature. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming loss, the human capacity for hope and renewal continued to assert itself. Plans were being made for reconstruction, even as destruction continued. Networks were being established that could support the recreation of alternative communities when the current crisis passed. Seeds were being planted that might grow into new forms of spiritual life, that learned from both the achievements and the failures of what was being lost. The women who engaged in this forward-looking work understood that they might not live to see the results of their efforts, but they also understood that the values and insights they had discovered through their own experiences were too valuable to allow to disappear simply because the institutions that had nurtured them were being destroyed. Their commitment to preserving and transmitting these values represented perhaps the most profound form of love possible. The willingness to work for benefits that would accrue to people they would never meet in circumstances they could not predict, according to principles that transcended their own immediate needs and desires. The secret sex lives of medieval nuns had evolved into something far more significant than anyone could have imagined when Catherine and Helene first exchanged glances across a scriptorium table. They had become the foundation for an entire alternative vision of human community that honoured both spiritual aspiration and emotional authenticity, that created space for both individual fulfillment and collective responsibility. As the plague continued its inexorable spread across Europe, consuming everything in its path, the women who had created this alternative vision faced their final test. Would their love prove strong enough to survive the ultimate challenge? Would their innovations endure beyond the destruction of the institutions that had sheltered them? Would their courage inspire others to continue the work they had begun? The answers would be written in the choices made by individual women facing impossible circumstances, in the documents hidden in walls and buried in gardens, in the songs whispered to children who might carry them forward into an uncertain future. The story of their resistance was approaching its end, but its legacy was just beginning to unfold in ways that would influence human possibilities for centuries to come. And in the infirmary of a small convent in France, two women who had loved each other across years of separation and through circumstances that would have defeated lesser souls, finally found themselves face to face as the world they had known crumbled around them. Their reunion would prove that some forms of love are indeed stronger than death, stronger than institutions, stronger even than the collapse of civilizations. The secret was no longer secret. It had become a testament to the enduring power of human connection in the face of forces designed to eliminate every trace of authentic feeling from the world. Their story ends not with defeat, but with affirmation. Not with silence, but with a song that continues to echo through the corridors of history, waiting for those with ears to hear and hearts to understand.